This is an interview conducted by Gladys Brown with the Misses Doris and Lucille Skillen, sisters, who live at 15 Bloomingdale Avenue, Akron, on February 10, 1981. Doris is the chief spokesman. Lucille makes a few remarks. He is one of the old families in our village. Would you give us some background on them?
My grandfather, Robert M. Skillen, came from Ireland, County Down, Ireland. And Belfast. And he was of the Martin clan. And he came to this country, as I remember, about the age of 19. And he married my grandmother, Amelia Tyler, whom I think came from the area in Pennsylvania. And my father, Burton Skillen, you better quit, but I'm going to say that. My grandfather, and he had one finger shot. And I think the marriage took place after he came home from service. And they had 3 children. My father was the only boy. And on my grandmother's side, I don't know too much about her family. She had 2 brothers I know about. And I asked her one day if the Tyler, who became president of the United States, was any relation to her, and she said, yes, a distant cousin. And Akron was their home all their lives, and they lived in several houses around town. Do you want? They lived at one time in the house that Mary Morris now owns, and the one across the street, Richardson's, and the house on Cedar Street where Mary Carl lives, and one where Burton Long lives, and the Stapleton house across from the park. And there are 2 or 3 others, and I'm not sure which location it is. Tyler had been appointed to his 4th term as postmaster in Akron. He was well liked by everybody. He took a particular interest in the Akron band. And when he died in 1910, the Akron band attended the funeral in Methodist Church and played at the church. And he was particularly fond of children. When the new Lincoln pennies came out, every child that came in the post office, he gave them a new penny. And I still have some of the pennies he gave to us in 1909. She was a homebody. She was noted for the salt rising bread she could make. She did a lot of crocheting and knitting, and always kept the 2 of us in knitted mittens and caps. What else? It was correct to me. She said there were 4 children, and I had said 3. I thought I said 4. Well, I told them to make mistakes. Grandparents lived with the one occupied by Stapleton across from the Russell Park. My mother took the 2 of us as small children to visit one day. And when she went in their new home, and when we came home at night, she told my dad that if all inside bathrooms were going to smell like that, she never wanted one. So that went on a while, and we went down again, and Grandma had baked bread again, and she offered us a piece of bread and butter. She'd made it that day. And my mother said, is that what smells in this house? She said, well, yes. Well, she said, I told Bert that if inside bathrooms were going to smell like that, I don't want one in our house. Our father, Burton Skillen, worked for the New York Central for 43 years as a telegrapher and towerman. He worked at what was called Akron Junction, where the Peanut and West Shore tracks crossed. When the automatic signals were put in, he was to be transferred, and seniority counted in placing jobs. And he had a chance to go to 3 different places: Syracuse, Bowmansville, or Buffalo. But because Lucille and I were both working in Buffalo, they decided to come to Buffalo so that we could be at home, which meant only nights because we were away daytimes. And my father then worked at Tower T at the new terminal for 13 years. And then he was taken ill and had to give up his job. And he and my mother lived in Buffalo in our flat on Humboldt Parkway for a year after he had to give up work. But it just meant to give Lucille and I a place to sleep at night. But they were not happy in the city. So I said, why don't you go back home? So that's what they did. They came out here, and the people who had rented our home, we asked them to move. And so we came back in the fall of 1939 to live, and it was like coming to a real home. My mother, who everyone in town knew as Feeney, was born in Wolcottsville. Her parents both came from Germany, and there were 5 children. And her father died when the children were very young, so the children had to get out and work. Her father was also a Civil War veteran. And it left my grandmother with a very small pension. She couldn't afford to keep her family, but she kept pigs and chickens and had her own garden. But the children went out and worked for the day. My mother had a chance to do the housekeeping work at the residence of Dr. McPherson in Akron, where she was for 8.5 years before she married my father. And the McPherson family gave my mother and father a catered wedding in their home. And that night they, of course, didn't have taxis or automobiles in town in 1899. So George Bostrick had a livery stable, and he brought a team of horses and a surrey to McPherson's residence and packed them up and brought them to their home here on 15 Bloomingdale Avenue, which was completely furnished and paid for when they were married.
Where was the Dr. McPherson's house?
Wait a minute. Oh, Dr. McPherson bought his home from Dr. Crane. And he was an outstanding doctor in this area. Everyone had faith in him. He did so much good for everyone. And of course, there were no automobiles then, so he had a driver to take him on all his night calls by horse and buggy. And it didn't matter whether it was in town or in the country. He answered his calls. And it was there that my mother worked for 8.5 years, taking calls for his services. And it was then that Dr. Foster was one of his drivers to take him on his calls. And after Dr. McPherson died at a very young age of 54, that home was then occupied by Dr. Ma. And as far as I know, after he left, is when Dr. Foster got the home.
Now, were all these nice floors in and everything?
My folks put these in for the Kramers that lived here while we were in Buffalo.
Oh.
Put it in for the tenants. They didn't take very good care of them. But anyway, the biggest changes were made in the 1950s.
You and your sister then were born in this house and lived here. Tell us about your younger days and what you did as children.
Well, we have many happy memories of our younger days, but of course our life wasn't like that of those young people now. We did more to occupy our own time than the children do now. We didn't have so many things, all that they had. For example, I started to tell you about the lumberyard over there, the Delver girls we played with. And we were allowed to take any scraps of lumber that were in the basket or on the floor. And we used to go over there and make our own stilts and sulkies for our dolls and use our time like that.
The lumberyard was across the street?
Yes. The lumberyard extended from Bloomingdale to Hoyt Avenue, Delver Lumber Company. Then Mr. Corbett left them. They were in business together, and he started the lumber yard over here. And his leg extended from Bloomingdale to Madison Avenue. And Mr. Belger built the houses up on East Avenue and up on the hill on the left-hand side. It's known as Belger's Heights. He built all the houses up there. And he also, when they moved from here down to the house now occupied by Dr. Ewinoff. And Mr. Belger died there. And after he was gone, Mrs. Belger moved into the house now occupied by the Schultz family on John Street, opposite Cedar Street. A lot of our time was taken up carding buttons. The button factory, which was across from the old Wheat's Ice Cream Company, now the Ford Gum place, used to make buttons out of nuts. And then they would dye them and shade them, and they would let them out to people in town to card them. They had orders for 12 dozen or more at a time, and they all had to be on cards, the shades all running one way. Well, the oldest Belger girl would get a big box or big order of buttons to card, and then she'd call us in to help her card. You have to start in the middle of the card and work around and come back. Start with a knot and end with 2 little stitches. And I think she paid us a penny a card. It's a dozen buttons on a card. But we'd spend our afternoons helping her get out a big order of buttons, carded buttons. And we played croquet. We had a big tent in our backyard. We put on shows. And in order to get in, you had to pay your way with pins. So you see, we had things that the other children had, but our life was more simplified, but we had an awfully good time. And when we went to the store, we had pennies to shop with. And my mother often said she didn't know how storekeepers would put up with all the children going in. And instead of buying one piece of candy that was good for a penny, we'd say, how many of these for a penny? And I shall never forget, one day I came home and I had some long black licorice sticks. I think I had 6 for a penny. My mother was so provoked to me. She said, what did you buy that for? Why did you buy one piece of candy and done with it? Well, I said, you got more. I thought I was shopping. She said, that's got white bugs inside. Well, I couldn't believe it, so I went out in the back in the garden and I split it open, and it did have white bugs in it.
What about your school days?
Well, the school days to start with were very sad. Kindergarten, I was the first one to go and didn't mind it, so I came home and taught Lucille everything. So when she went, that was okay, and kindergarten went by all right. But when it came the first day to go to first grade and all the other grades, it was like going to a funeral. We cried the first few days every time. Remember that? We didn't want to go to school. We couldn't wait until noon to come home for lunch. But that soon wore off. And we got along all right. We always passed. And my father never was interested in the marks we got in subjects. He always looked at the department mark. And if that was below an A, he wanted to know what was wrong. But it wasn't very often, I guess, because we had to toe the mark. Behave yourselves and respect your teachers. That was our lesson through life. And I think if more of that was done now, it would be better for our world. So, I know I came home from school one day, and this was when I was in high school, and I was finding fault with one of the teachers. My father listened at great length. He said, is that all you got to say? I said, yes. Well, he said, what did you do? I said, nothing. He said, that's all. My folks never went to school to see a teacher that they had harmed us or done anything wrong to us. When we came home with a complaint, that ended it. We could tell it at home, but that ended it right then and there. No more. Just behave yourselves.
Go ahead.
Our parents were very good to us. My father never struck us for behavior. All he would do is speak. We could ask him if he could do something once. If he said no, we knew enough not to ask him a second time. But my mother, we sort of cozied around her and would tease. And then if we did something wrong during the day, my father was usually late coming home for dinner at night, having worked for the railroad. And my mother would give us our dinner early and warm his up when he came home. So when she was getting his ready to put on the table, we would run to the dining room table to the stove. Mama, please don't tell. We'll never do it again. But when he saw all this running around going on, he said, well, what happened today? Then my mother would tell him, well, that settled that right there. So you see, we were a little more respectful of my father than my mother. But I will say this, as good as my mother was to us, we did get paddled. And Lucille was always so good, I didn't think she could ever do any wrong. But one day she was getting a whipping for something. What, I don't know. But my mother said, I really got bold. I walked up to her, put my hands on my hips, and I said, you leave her alone. We had to take our responsibility at home. As soon as we were able, we had to wash dishes. We were given things to do. And I liked to clean, so that was all right with me. And Lucille always did she was a perfectionist from a child up. And she wasn't having any trouble taking a job cleaning away from me, but my mother would give her the vegetables to fix. And on my side porch facing the Hicks residence, she could go out there in good weather and get the vegetables ready. And my mother said, are they ready yet? She said, you give me all the pokey jobs and you think I'm not doing much. Well, we got through grade school, which was the old grammar school where the town hall now stands. Then we went to high school where the Masonic Temple is. And that, of course, burned down. And then we were graduated from the old Park Theater. That was a big place in town to go.
That served as an auditorium, didn't it, for the school?
We didn't have an auditorium big enough for graduation. So we had graduated from the Park Theater. Lucille and I graduated together. I took 4 years for high school, and at that time, Miss Leopold wanted to try an experiment with 8 children. And she wanted to see if they could go through high school in 3 years. So she started out, and they all dropped out except Lucille and Hilda Brown. And they went on and completed high school in 3 years. So Lucille and I both graduated in 1920. And Lucille received the last gold medal that was given by George Davis as having the highest record in the school. After we graduated from high school, during our senior year, of course, people were coming out to enlist us in going to school. And my mother wanted both of us to become teachers. She said that she didn't have a chance to go on to school, and she and my father both wanted to give us every opportunity to go. And I couldn't make up my mind what I wanted to do. And so Miss Leopold talked to me, and she said, well, why don't you make this agreement with your parents? Go to Buffalo State, which was then Buffalo Normal, and try the home economics course, because I like things about the home. And if you don't like it, that they will let you quit and do something else. So that's what I did. And Lucille, my mother wanted her to become a kindergarten teacher because she was doing well with music and she thought it would be a good thing for her. And she said, well, you needn't talk teaching to me because I'll never be a teacher. If you want me to be a teacher, you can make up your mind to take care of me the rest of your lives. I want to go to Bryant Stratton or some business school. Well, a man had been out to talk to them about business courses. And she came home and she said, I want to sign up to go to Bryant Stratton. Well, my mother and father talked it over, and they thought if she was going to do the work, she should have the chance to choose what she wanted to do. So she signed up for the business efficiency course at Bryant Stratton and finished it in 12 months instead of 14 or something like that. And then she went into private secretarial work and bookkeeping for investments. And she worked on that for years. And when the new Liberty Bank building was being built, she was working at the Ellicott Square building for the firm. Was it Griffith Kendall in Rochester then? Griffith and Kendall. Griffith and Kendall. Well, they wanted offices in the new Liberty Bank building, so they went up in a freight elevator to the 20th floor and picked the site that they wanted for the offices. And that's where she worked.
Where did you teach?
I taught, my folks, we didn't have to go to Buffalo work for our board. They paid our board at the Y. And did we ever have a good time living at the Y? In spite of all that we had schoolwork to do, we did find time for a good time there. It wasn't the fanciest place to live, but it was a Christian place. So we lived at the Y, and my folks paid our board and tuition. And then I felt I had to have a job, so I was taking the city exams, but I wasn't sure I had passed, was going to pass. So I was interviewed for a job in East Aurora High School, and I was hired. So I taught in East Aurora for 1 year. Well, I passed the city exams, and I started teaching at $1,200 a year. By the time I paid my board, I had no car, paying bus fare from East Aurora to Akron every weekend because I had to be home. I didn't have much left. So when they gave me a chance for an appointment in Buffalo, they said I could start at the regular wage of $1,400, and they would give me $100 for my year's experience. So I started at $1,500 in Buffalo, and then I taught for 36 years in Buffalo.
Where? What school did you teach in?
I taught at school 37 on Carlton Street. I had 2 years of high school work plus grade work there. And at 52 and 66 over the period of years, depending on how the schedule ran, they put you in school. But usually 18 years for my in school. Well, let's see, we were boarding in Buffalo. Well, then when they closed the station out here, my father decided to come to Buffalo. We rented a flat of a friend, furnished, so they decided what they wanted to do for 6 months. Well, then they moved into Buffalo, and then we went home and lived. But before that time, we were living with the Frank Gott family, who was then principal of Lafayette High School. They were friends of ours. We lived with them and then when they came home to live after my father had to quit work for a year, I continued living with them for 10 years. Why we lived in was Niagara Square, and Braddon Stratton is where the Stafford Hotel now stands, where my sister went there. But while she was going there, they were building or equipping that place at the Main North. They were getting ready to build the Statler. They were tearing down the building that the school was in. They were getting ready to build the Statler Hotel. So then Brian Stratton moved up to Main and North, and I finished up there. And then she walked from the Y to Main and North every day home. All the original people left on Bloomingdale when we came here are Ona Holmes and Doris and myself. All the other residents have changed.
There was a doctor next door, right?
Dr. Hicks, he was a dentist. But before him, a family by the name of Robinson lived there. When Irene Dunn lived there too, after the Robinsons left. Now Mary Jane, Sean, and her family live there. Grand neighbors. This person was very, very outstanding. If you mention any old people back to me first, you said everything. He was so wonderful, really. And Dr. Moss, Dr. Hillary, Dr. Pringle, and those we didn't get to know as well. But Dr. McPherson was our family doctor. Oh, it would be so muddy when he came into the house. But he was always on call. He worked himself to death. And at 54, you can imagine how he worked. He had stroke and died.
Mm-hmm. They were all ready to move to California before he died. And so,
because he had had a stroke then and knew he had to give up, so they were going to California to live. And then he had another stroke, which took him. So he was buried here. His wife and children went out to California to live. And Lucille and my mother went out there to see them in 37. Train service in this town. 2 trains, passenger trains into Buffalo every morning, and 2 coming out at night. And John Dodd, who owned and operated the Newstead Hotel, he used to go in. He had a city job. I forgot what his title was. Every morning. But I guess the train would pull in while he was eating his breakfast, and Patsy White was all ready to take up the stool and get on the train. And they said, John isn't down. So he'd look over and said, come on, John, we're ready to go. And he'd come down with a cigarette in his mouth, and they'd wait for John to get on the train to go. Oh, it was just a good old hometown feeling.
What do you know about the Presbyterian Church in Akron?
Well, I know this. It was, to me, the most beautiful little church I ever saw. And sad to say, I have never felt at home in any church like I did there, ever. And I think it was the early 20s that it was abandoned. The Presbytery took it over, and it was eventually moved over to Pembroke, and it's still there.
Some people get in their heads that you have to belong to certain classes or a certain group of people in order to be in the 400 group. But that number means nothing to me. You are only judged by your character. Well, I'll have to call him Whitwire because I didn't know him by any other name. And I don't say that disrespectful, but it was Whitwire. Lived in the house where Mrs. Sutton lived. And he used to travel. And what islands he went to, I do not know. But he used to have the natives string beads for him, Job's tears and coral and all kinds of seeds, long beads. And when he would come back in the spring, on a nice summer's day, he would put 2 crates out in front with a stick across with all these beads hanging on. And anyone in town that walked down there could have a string of those beads. And we still have some of those. And he was a member of the Masonic Lodge. And I don't know where he died, but it seems to me that Miss Mason took charge of burying his body. And Mrs. Sutton got the home after he lived in it. Who had the settling of his estate, I don't know. But as far as I know, he was not connected with the Wickwire Bank in town.
Remember the Chautauquas that used to come to town?
Well, Lucille can tell you more about that than I can.
Well, they had a big tent up on Madison Avenue where all the trees are now, about where Dick Forrestall's house is up in that area. And we had 3 entertainments a day, morning, afternoon, and evening. And I think just about everybody in town took the week off and we all went up to the entertainments. And it was really loads of fun. And they had real good performers up there. I remember seeing the first gyroscope I ever heard of. A man came up there with that and had it on the platform. And he would walk and come to a corner. And he couldn't turn the corner until he set that thing down and let it turn. I know they had so many interesting things up there. It was just a deal. We had it in town for several years. I guess it just sort of petered out. I don't know whether they even had them anymore after that.
You don't know what we did for the time. My father didn't have time to come home during the week for lunch. My mother always said he should get wheeled on a dinner pail because it was such a big one. You know, one with the coffee on top with a cup on top. But he used to take enough for 2 meals because sometimes he'd have to stay and cook up there. And
Now, this was when he was working up at the junction.
And on Sundays, he usually there wasn't as much train business. He usually had time to come home for his dinner. And then he would take the 3 of us back with him to work for the afternoon. And he had what they called a speeder that he pumped on the tracks. And he'd set the 3 of us on there and take us up there for the afternoon. And bring us back at night. And we used to love that for a change.
Was that like a hand car?
Yeah, it was just like Hantley.
That's how he went to work. From where? From the West Shore Depot on Cedar Street?
Right beyond the Akron station, there was a shed that he kept it in. They had it for him there. Across from what was the old freight house. He'd have to put it on the track. Well, he had that for a few years. Then they provided a motor for him. And he built his own, and so then it ran with gasoline, so all he had to do was to start it and go like a car, but on the tracks. So we did that. Well, then in the spring of the year, when strawberries were coming out, he'd put us out in the field there, and we'd pick wild strawberries on a Sunday afternoon. And then, on Sunday afternoon, we were not allowed to play games like Old Maid and Flinch and all that on Sunday. We'd go to church and Sunday school, come home and have our dinner. My dad would go back to work. And for the afternoon, we sat under a large split leaf maple tree in front. And my mother always popped corn and made us a batch of fudge. And we sat out there and read. So you see, we didn't have too exciting a life, but we always had a good time. I mean, we were contented. That was the important thing.
Well, and my dad knew where the trains were when he left the junction up there. And if he could start for home and did, and we'd always sometimes have to get up and take that speeder off the track and wait for a train to go by. And one morning in the winter, he had a walk-up. He couldn't go on the speeder. And he got as far
It was too icy.
he got as far as Jackson Street. And he said his eyes began almost to freeze shut. So he walked back home. And he went down to the station and waited until a train came, so he went up on the train.
You see, people nowadays, you know, people in those days had honor. They wanted to work and earn a living. And now if it's too hard, they just want a handout. And now we're in the mess we're in. So honor, that's what I would say. Believe in God and be honest is your best salvation. Always. And if you do get in difficult times, there's always a way to help you out. Always. We have blessings to count every day. We've had a lot of sickness, a lot of ups and downs, but we're just thankful for everything.
Hardest was Dr. Elgin used to live there when we were little children. And he was the pastor at the First Baptist Church on Main Street for a good many years. And he and his wife were real elderly when we were little. And if we had company, they always sat on their front porch, and when we had company, after they'd gone, and he saw one of us out, in the quivery voice, he'd say, "Doris, Lucille, who is that at your house today?" He was.
We have the Civil War book that he had with his picture.
Civil War.
Chaplain in the Civil War, some group of people. I almost think it was for the black people, if I remember right. Bloomingdale used to be a mud road when we were little children. I can remember when you could hardly walk across the street without getting deep in a mud puddle.
Lose your rubbers.
You lose your rubbers in it. So you can see there's been a lot of changes on the streets since we began as little youngsters.
What kind of street lights were there when you were young?
Oh, the man used to come around that worked for the village, and there was a light hanging in the middle of the street, and he had a long taper with fire and lit the mantle.
Gas light.
It was a gas light. And we had gas lights in our house, too, after we had these oil lamps, you know. And then the next style was to have gas lamps. And you had a mantle you put on, you know what they are?
Yes.
So the hall light burned out. My father had a new mantle, he put it on a table in the hall. And I was little, he said, "Doris, don't put your finger in that." Right away I did. And he looked at my mother, she said, "Don't scold her," she said, "if you kept still, she wouldn't have done that." And then one day he went down to Grandma Skillen's. That's when she lived in Richard's house. And he came home with 2 penknives that he had as a child. And he gave one to Lucille and he gave one to me. And we asked him what they were for. He showed us how to open the blade. Well, he and my mother were doing the dishes. We were so quiet, they came here and looked. And on the woodwork around the hall doors here, we were carving all the corners of.
How old were you then?
Oh, we were about this time, probably about 4 or 5, maybe, or 4 or 5 or 6 years old. I don't know. What's going to happen to all this stuff when we're gone? You know, over the years, you collect so much. But you know, sometimes you forget what you have. Maybe you don't ever reach that point yet, but we have. And my mother's one desire was to have a hall rack. You know, with a glass and a place and an umbrella rack, and then you lifted the cover and put your rubbers in. Well, John Jones Furniture Shop downtown had them, and so my father said, "Yeah." So she did. Well, we moved that into Buffalo with us and had it at the hall there. And when we moved back here, it stood here by the stairway. I said, I don't like that thing there. So we put it down cellar. And my mother came out. She said, where's my hall rack? And I said, it's down cellar. She said, down cellar? And I said, yes, it didn't look good in the living room. Well, so then she didn't want it down cellar, so now it's up in the attic. And it has stood so long that it's all in perfectly good shape, but it's dried out and it's, come apart. So we'd have to get someone to put it together. Well, from Simon Zavara out in the country, his mother died, and they had an auction sale about a year ago. And they had 2 home wrecks. And they had this auction quite widely advertised because they had antiques. It was at Jagler's in Wolfentsville, maybe you know about it. And one hall rack went to an antique dealer for $300, and another one for $600. I couldn't believe it, but my cousin's daughter was there, and she said, yes, that was true.
Another little bit of history on the street, I was thinking. Down on the corner of Eckerson and Bloomingdale used to be a wheat field. And where Irene Peck's house stood, or stands now, there used to be a wheat field when we were little kids.
Mr. Wilder owned all that land. And he made huge house. Belger built that house. Anderson had that house built. He was a tailor in town.
John Anderson.
Had the Dr. Stanbury's house built.
Yes. And Mr. Wilder owned that park and he gave it to the village. Mr. Wilder lived in that little house across the street.
Where Barry's lived.
When they moved in the village, but before that they lived where your friend lives out in the country. What's her name? Quite a bit of land he owned from Corbett's tenant house down to the corner and then this lot up here.
One of his sons, and he was a veterinarian, and he lived right across the street from us where Young lived.
And one winter I had just a terrible cold. I coughed just terrible. I got so sore I could hardly breathe anymore. My mother had doctored and doctored me and I just got the cough. So one day Mrs. Wilder said to my mother, would you give that child some horse medicine if I gave it to you? My mother said, I'm willing to try anything. She said, I have doctored with that child all weeks and weeks. And so I can taste it and see it yet. It was a light green syrup medicine. She gave it to me and the cough stopped. Now they have DMSO. I'll give you a word about that, of course, haven't you? For arthritis. Well, a friend of ours was out from California this summer. Lucille told her I was having some pain in my arm. And she said, well, tell her to get some DMSO. And she said a friend of mine was so crippled with arthritis, she was on crutches. And she said she got it and she's walking as good as I am now. But it's only legal in 2 states, Oregon and Florida. Well, I have places, friends in both places that I could get it. And but I had a terrific time with dermatitis that I've been going to the doctor for so long. And I went over to Dr. Lucas. I said to him, what do you know about DMSO? I said, I've been having a terrible time with arthritis. And I know you're not an arthritic doctor, but having been over here so much in my skin, I want to know. He said, see your doctor first. He said, it gets into your bloodstream. I can tell you that much.
Are you taking this?
Huh? And so then the next time I went to Town Park to get a prescription filled, they had a sign up, DMSO for veterinarians. And I said, can I get this here? And he said, yes. He said, it's for animals. I said, I heard it's good for arthritis. And he said, then Lucille spoke up and she said, why, does it get in your bloodstream? He said, yes, it does. Well, then Mary Jane's mother-in-law is a librarian at a hospital in
Wheeling, West Virginia.
Wheeling, West Virginia. And she told her that I was thinking about getting some. And she sent word back. She said, tell her not to get it. We have patients in the hospital that are here getting healed from burns. They're caused by that. And this girl from California said, you cannot rub it on or you'll get terribly burned. You just have to pat it on. She said they use it on athletes on the field. If you see someone get hurt and they pat something on a DMSO. And so now you see it advertised advertised widely. Now you can buy it in hardware stores and all. But it's only been legalized in 2 states. Every fall we got 2 pigs and a quarter beef. And my mother and father had a big bench in the back room. They cut the pig out. We had our own salt pork. And they cured the hams in salt water. And my father made a portable smokehouse we had in the backyard. And we took my mother's kettle about that big with the 3 legs on the bottom that we used for the fire pot. And we bought our popcorn by the bushel on the ear, and then we had to rub 2 ears together to shell. Have you ever done that? And get your hands scraped sometimes. And we saved all those cobs to smoke our hams with. In the morning, my father carried those hams out, and the night he brought them in. And I know Rance Mexon's son, Hubert, was reading the meters one day, and they were hanging down the cellar, and he came upstairs. He said to my mother, Mrs. Skillman, would you sell me one of those hams? No, she said, Hubert, that's too much work. I can't sell those. But we had our own hams, our own sausage smoked, own bacon, and then we had our own link sausage. Mrs. Belger had a sausage stuffer. We got the inwards from the pig, and we turned them wrong side out and washed them in salt water and scraped all those. I can remember doing that. Said, imagine all that work. You thought nothing of it. And then we had like a little back shed on the back of our house, and the quarter beef hung up there. And we'd open it, my mother would open the window, she'd slice off some beef, and we'd have it for dinner. And then we didn't have a car, needless to say, until after we were through school and started to work. And every fall, my father wrote an order into J. and Adams grocery store on Washington Street, back of their Main Street store, and ordered a case of salmon, a case of peas, and a case of corn. Well, when they would come into the freight house down here, we would go down there with my dad with a wheelbarrow. And we felt that we were feeling gold home. You tell that to kids now. Oh, we have lots of things you can think about that we enjoy that people wouldn't think, oh, no. But we did.
All together. I'll show it to you. I got some pieces at the corner store, but it's now Bosco's. It used to be called just a corner store, and Charlie Howard had it. Well, he used to go around mornings to certain of his customers and take their order with his little board. He'd go back to the store, fill the order, and deliver it. Where would you get that kind of service today?
And if it's only a matter of a few cents he was getting, maybe they'd only need a pound of this or a box of seasoning or something. But he'd take the order for it, go back and get it and bring it to you. When I think of how people worked to earn a living then and now, what they get, and I'm still complaining. I'm satisfied, but you know, this wanting more all the time's got to end someday.